Welcome to Biomechanics on Our Minds. My name is Melissa Boswell.
And I'm Hannah O'Day, and we're PhD students at Stanford University.
This podcast is brought to you by the International Society of Biomechanics.
It's
time for Boom.
Welcome to Boom, where we have
Biomechanics on our minds.
Boom.
Boom.
Boom. Boom. Boom.
Boom.
Welcome back to Boom.
Welcome to Boom.
Woohoo! I am Hannah.
And I'm Melissa.
And today we talk with Jess Fiedorowicz, who is an MD PhD, and he wears a lot of hats. He is the chief and head of the Department of Mental Health at the Ottawa Hospital, and a professor and senior research chair in Adult Psychiatry in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Ottawa. He is also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Psychosomatic Research.
We talked about the peer review process and Jess shared a lot of helpful tips, as well as reinforced why it's so important and should be part of our role as scientists. I was excited to talk about the peer review process, as I was recently asked to review a paper and didn't know, where to even start. So we were kind of inspired to touch on this in an episode of Boom. But then we also learned about his really interesting work on bipolar disorder, and he shares some of his advice on prioritizing by passion. We really enjoyed this interview, and we think you will too.
Let's jump on in.
Well,
to a bit of Boom.
Boom.
Well, we're jumping into Boom.
Yes,
I never said what we were jumping into.
Yeah, it's ambiguous, but we're all just going to hold hands and jump in.
Bit of boom. Bit of boom. Lily. Bit of boom. Bit of boom.
So today's bit of Boom is related to our interview, surprise, surprise, since we talk about the peer review process today. We wanted to share the first journal that actually established a formal peer review process and a little bit of that history.
Exciting. I was never much of a good history student, you could say, throughout school. But I'm finding as I'm getting older, I'm enjoying learning about history a lot more. So I'm excited to learn about this.
That's what my mom always said, that as you age, history is more of your own thing because you're seeing history play out.
Since I'm getting old, thank you.
So this journal is the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, which sounds pretty fancy. The Royal Society is pretty fancy. It's the world's oldest independent scientific academy, and it's dedicated to promoting excellence in science. The Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, so this is the journal, was established in 1665 and was the first journal in the world devoted entirely to science. And therefore, it's also the world's longest running scientific journal.
Wow. That is very old. That's much older than I was expecting.
Yeah. It's older than the country that Melissa and I are in right now, the US.
Wow. Another fun fact.
It was established in London, as you might imagine,
Yeah.
The use of the word philosophical in the title of the journal actually refers to natural philosophy, which is what we would now call science. And you might recognize some of the authors that were published in this journal, just to name a few: Isaac Newton, Ben Franklin, Dorothy Hodgkin, Alan Turing, Stephen Hawking, even Charles Darwin. And the list really goes on. There's quite a few on the Wikipedia page of the, most notable authors that have published there.
Yeah. I always wondered where those people published. That's awesome.
And then just one other little fun fact was in 2017, the Royal Society actually launched a completely redigitized version of the complete journal archive back to 1665 in high resolution and with enhanced metadata. So you can basically see all of the copyrighted material that's now completely free to access without even a login to the site. So really trying to make science accessible to the community. And there's some fun history there. So that was exciting.
That's so interesting. Yeah, because I was thinking about what a journal in 1665 might look like. And my guess is very different than it does now. But it's awesome that they're digitizing it. So we can look back on some of the earliest publications.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever read one of Charles Darwin's first author papers.
Right. And also,
crazy.
It'd be pretty cool to be like, I published in the same journal as Isaac Newton.
We are excited to be talking today with Dr. Jess Fiedorowicz. Jess is the head and chief of the Department of Mental Health at the Ottawa Hospital and a professor and senior research chair in Adult Psychiatry in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Ottawa. He is also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Psychosomatic Research, and we're really looking forward to learning more about what that's like and how we can be better peer reviewers, something we haven't talked about on Boom. So we're really glad you're here, and thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, we're happy to have you on. But before we dive into peer review, can you first share with us what got you interested in pursuing a career in science and medicine? From what I could find from some brief internet stalking, it seemed to happen at a pretty early age and influenced by your family.
I knew I wanted to go into a career in medicine from a pretty early age. I grew up in a small town in rural northern Wisconsin that had a volunteer rescue squad, and I volunteered for that squad as soon as I turned 16. And so as a high schooler, I was taking overnight call, and they were pretty long calls when I got called in because we'd have to often drive people an hour to Green Bay and back, and then getting to the scene and all the work at the scene.
Wow.
So from an early age, I knew I wanted to be a physician and went to undergraduate as a pre-med, although I did change my major 4 times. I did remain pre-med, went to medical school, and I think ended up in a career that was very different than what I might have envisioned as a young boy growing up in rural northern Wisconsin.
Sounds like a pretty intense job for a high school student.
Yeah, it was volunteer, but it was, I would get paged in the middle of watching friends play in a sporting event or,
Oh my gosh.
at 2 or 3 in the morning. And then once I would get paged, I would drive in to the station, we'd go to the scene, we'd take care of things. And sometimes we'd have to bring people into the hospital. And so getting called in could be 2-3 hours. Very different than my practice as a psychiatrist. I still take call, but it's not going to the scene of an accident or anything like that.
You had different kinds of all-nighters than most high schoolers.
Yes, certainly. Yeah. And I'm afraid I did have some situations where I did see some of my classmates while on call.
Thank you for sharing that. Now, jumping to today, we'd love to hear a brief overview of your current research, which focuses on primary causes of excess mortality, suicide, and vascular disease, quite a range, in bipolar and other mood disorders. And it looks like your work has been extremely interdisciplinary. When you worked at the University of Iowa, you were faculty in psychiatry, epidemiology, and internal medicine. And now you're a clinical investigator in neurosciences program, the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute. So many words and names and departments. It's really exciting to hear.
That's the interdisciplinary pieces, and the breadth is really a pretty astute observation. And I would say, there are pros and cons of having more or less focus. I'm certainly not one of those researchers that's studying a particular gene and the protein that it encodes and only that. I would describe my research expertise as being T-shaped, and there's been talk about that as being sort of a model for clinical and translational researchers. And so the breadth of the T covers a number of areas where I can collaborate and work with other people because I have some knowledge. And then this part of the T, the vertical part of the T, for those that are listening, is where I have more depth. And I would describe those areas content-wise as being morbidity and mortality in bipolar disorder. And my mortality focus has been on suicide and vascular disease. And I'll just explain why briefly before I sort of go into the methods expertise. Those individuals with bipolar disorder have a standardized mortality ratio of about 2, meaning they're about twice as likely to die as you'd expect based on their age and sex from the general population. So it's a pretty huge mortality difference and a major health disparity. That's a ratio of how many deaths that you observe in a sample versus how many you expect based on their age and gender. We can look at excess deaths, which is the difference between how many you observe and how many you expect. And that allows us to identify sort of what causes seem the most relevant. And about a third of the excess deaths are due to cardiovascular disease, and another third are due to suicide. And the rest is sort of a mix of other causes. And so my focus has been on those 2 leading causes of excess mortality. suicide and cardiovascular disease.
What do you think, I guess, from this disease, is there some link to cardiovascular issues with, I guess I wouldn't think of that necessarily with bipolar disorder. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting and likely quite multifactorial, right? So I talked about sort of what are the most relevant causes for this mortality gap, but then even within, one of those causes, things I think are fairly complex and multifactorial. And so there was a recent paper that came out looking at sort of genetic overlap between genetic risk factors for neuropsychiatric illness and cardiovascular disease. And there indeed appears to be that. And so one thing that's in common between sort of neurons, cells in the heart, cells in the pancreas, or at least the endocrine cells in the pancreas, is that they're excitable cells. And so, genetic abnormalities that might impact one could impact another. There's also evidence that individuals with mental disorders are less likely to have the appropriate screening, and when identified, less likely to have the appropriate treatments for a lot of risk factors for cardiovascular diseases. So that's another piece. And there's a physician bias called sort of diagnostic overshadowing, where when one diagnosis is present, the physicians are less likely to think of other things. And diagnostic overshadowing indeed appears to be in place for these conditions. There was an interesting study where they just sent letters to family physicians asking how they would treat this patient. And in those letters, it was randomized to whether or not the patient had a diagnosis of major depression, which is not an especially stigmatized psychiatric disorder and a pretty common one. And whether that was in there or not influenced the care and adversely influenced the care when present. And that's just in a letter that's sent to physicians. And so this is an issue. Patients with bipolar disorder, persons with bipolar disorder are more likely to smoke. Some may be less likely to engage in other sort of health-related behaviors. And so that's another factor. When the condition's identified and treatments are provided, they may be less likely to take them for a variety of reasons. And so there's a whole litany of behaviors and factors that might be influencing this. One piece that's also been interesting is that we know that there are pretty clear physiologic effects of stress, and that we see that across species. And it seems very plausible, and there's some evidence to support the idea that mood disorders may hijack the stress circuitry, and sort of cause it to be overactivated and chronically activated in a manner that could have adverse health effects as well. So there's all sorts of interesting pieces to study this, and it's certainly not something that where we can identify sort of a clear sort of single cause.
We find that in, all areas, but I feel like anything neuro-based and in psychology, it's particularly challenging to pinpoint specific mechanisms or causes. Things
get complicated pretty quickly.
Yeah.
I'm working on a manuscript that's looking at the suicide piece, which I wasn't talking about here, but we were doing an analysis to try to see how much we could attribute various symptoms to at least cross-sectional risk of having suicidal thoughts or having had a recent suicide attempt. And the fraction that we could explain by the symptoms that we were capturing, which included symptoms of depression, mania, anxiety, was somewhat small. And so, there's a lot of things that go into some of these complex diseases and behaviors.
Yeah, definitely. And even sometimes the labeling of the disease is kind of an umbrella term, where it's also just kind of a best guess of, based on the symptoms, what disease they're being labeled with. So that, I'm sure, also opens up a whole other, area of challenges.
These conditions are almost certainly heterogeneous. We know that from the genetic studies that have been done. So even though, for instance, bipolar disorder is highly heritable on the order of 80%-ish, there's not a clear genetic cause, and there have been large genetic studies. There have been genes that have been associated, but it's not, these things are not simple. They're complex, multifactorial, heterogeneous. And almost certainly our clinical diagnoses, which are descriptive, are not sort of carving things out at the joints.
Yeah, and we see that a lot in movement disorders too, things like ALS and Parkinson's, these different movement disorders where they're just, analyzing their symptoms and just kind of giving this a more of an umbrella term or best guess of what it could be. But then, it's really not necessarily that, or I guess could be the subcategories in it. There's just a whole spectrum of diseases and more research that needs to be done.
When I was a resident, I had a number of faculty physicians that used to talk about how, we're at the stage with these sort of descriptive diagnoses and syndromes of distinguishing between like wet and dry gangrene, like was done generations ago. So we have a long way to go, to get sort of more physiologically homogeneous sort of diagnostic groupings for sure.
But one thing I will say that I'm hearing in, all that you're talking about in your interdisciplinary work is that you really need both the, statistical rigor of these tests and being able to explain, variance and these things, but you also need the training and expertise as a clinician and like to be able to interpret what you're seeing. And I think it's nice that can have both of those perspectives in both your research and being a clinician.
Yeah, I think those things can certainly complement each other. Yeah, they can also be a distraction, of course, right? Like I'm not able to sort of commit as much time in the lab as might be someone who's a non-physician as well. So there's certainly trade-offs. And so I think it's good to have people with from a variety of disciplines with different training backgrounds trying to tackle some of the same problems and questions that we're facing.
Yeah. And I think I could keep talking about this probably for the rest of the episode, but we'll try to transition a little bit so we met over email when I was asked to peer review a paper for the Journal of Psychosomatic Research.
Thank you for that great review, by the way.
You're very welcome. So you're the editor-in-chief for that journal. And I was nervous to give the review because I hadn't reviewed for a journal before. And so I decided to email you and just say, like, I'm a PhD student. I haven't reviewed a manuscript before, but, I'm happy to. I want to contribute and learn. But can you help me a little? Or like, are there journal-specific instructions? I just want to give you a heads up. I don't really know what I'm doing. And you I was very surprised by your very just generous response. You offered resources and advice, and then you even offered to provide feedback on my review. So I could tell that you're really passionate about the importance of good peer review. And I guess I'm curious with my recent experience of my first review, if you remember what your first experience was like as a peer reviewer. And maybe that's why you're so empathetic to my experience.
I don't exactly remember the details of like the paper that I first did a review for. I know it was in 2007, so I would have been in my like second year of my research fellowship at the time.
Okay.
And it was something that my mentor had handed off to me. So he had been invited to review this paper, and he suggested me as a reviewer, and that was sort of how I had my first experience at that time. So, and you're right, it is daunting. You're giving feedback for I think what is the most important part of or at least the maybe not the most important is the right word, because very many important decisions come up before then. But the ultimate process of preparing research for dissemination, which is our goal, right, is disseminating new knowledge when we're doing research. And that is done through peer-reviewed publications, or at least primarily through that process. So it is a very important process. And I think it's a responsibility for all of us. And that's one of the reasons why I take on as many reviews as I do. And in the process of taking on as many reviews as I did, that's actually how I became an editor. So I had done a lot of reviews for a lot of journals, and then got invited to be associate editor in several positions. And then ultimately it was that set the stage for becoming a journal editor.
We actually would love to hear more about being a journal editor. You just mentioned all of the things you do, and then kind of getting sucked in and really making your way to that.
Yeah. So, I think like reviewing, it's sort of a labor of love, right? Like it's an important part of the process. I do get paid for my work as an editor, but, not to the degree of what my other work does. And reviewers tend not to get paid for their work where they're, for advancing their science. So there's sort of in some ways, it's a responsibility that we have as members of the academic and intellectual community to be sort of safeguarding what gets disseminated and working to improve the quality of what gets disseminated into the biomedical or other scientific literatures. And this year in particular has been a very interesting year as an editor. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but my understanding is that across the board for many journals, at least within the medical literature, and this may be true for other literatures as well, that the volume of submissions is way up. So my journal had an uptick this past year of about 50% increase in submissions. And I'm told that that's consistent with other journals. That's not some sort of idiosyncrasy of my journal, but people are writing more during these quarantines and working from home and in various sort of alternative arrangements that they've been forced to participate in this pandemic.
Yeah, finally catching up
more time for reviewing too.
Yeah, so it's harder to find reviewers then too. I think some people are maybe doing more and some are doing less, but because there's the sudden increase in the volume of submissions, I think is sort of jarring the entire system.
I guess that makes sense. It felt like for me too, finally catching up on writing and this kind of like backlog when it's, exciting to go into the lab and collect data. And I'm curious if someone is totally new to the peer review process and gets an invitation to be a reviewer, what advice would you give them to get started and I guess feel a little bit more confident in reviewing?
Yeah, so there are some online resources that are available for this. And I think I shared some of those with you. That you can look into. I also think another critical piece is just setting aside enough time for it. So I can tell from looking at reviews when someone's really sort of dove into the paper and tried to thoughtfully do it versus whether they've quickly done it. I've even seen sort of the unfortunate circumstance where I get email alerts when like reviewers accept or decline my invitation and when reviews come in. And I've had situations where I'm working with my email on, which I do probably more often than I should. And all of a sudden, bing, someone accepted an invitation to review. And so I'm excited. And then I'm working some more. And then like 15 or 20 minutes later, bing, the review comes in. And it's sort of like, whoa, this cannot be a quality review. And, of course, I then go look at it and it is indeed not. And so then I need to make sure that I have adequate review of this paper, which means sort of, getting another reviewer, making sure the other review is very solid and detailed or what have you. So taking time for the process is an important piece. Another thing I think people don't realize that I feel like my journal probably interfaces with a little bit more than other journals, but I think is true for probably any journal given the need for interdisciplinary team science in so many domains right now. And that is most of the papers that I'm sending out, there is going to be no one or very few people that have expertise in all aspects of that paper. As an example, so the Journal of Psychosomatic Research is at the interface of psychology and medicine. And there's all sorts of things that can happen at that interface, right? So I'm just completely making this up at the top of my head, but I could have someone be presenting a paper on psoriasis and X mental disorder, and the association, right? There may be very few people that published on that particular comorbidity. Even there might be people that look at comorbidities with psoriasis and comorbidities with whatever mental disorder is sort of relevant. And then on top of that, right, they may have used a particular method or statistical approach that someone may not have expertise in. So by the time you combine the various merging of contents that comes in with a paper and the methods that are being applied, there are a few people that have expertise in all of that. Mm-hmm. And so one thing I find very helpful as an editor and encourage people to do as a reviewer is if there's a part of the paper that you feel like you're have concerns about but aren't really qualified to weigh in on, or you weighed in on something but you have some uncertainty about it, you can communicate that in your confidential comments to the editor. And that's like a perfect use of that. And so it can cue me into saying like, oh, I need to make sure that I have someone with expertise in this statistical method because this reviewer is telling me that they don't, or that I get someone that has, this particular content expertise to complement the expertise of the person that I have. I have enough submissions that there are some people where I have a sense of the reviewer's expertise and others where it may not be so clear. And so don't assume that the editor knows exactly what your expertise is. And if there's a piece that you're not able to review with the level of detail, then just let them know. And then another piece is just sort of the overall mindset. And so I think a healthy mindset to take into it is oftentimes we're doing these, we're super busy, we're squeezing them in. There may be things that the authors are doing that are really irritating or that sort of really bother you or that you find inappropriate. But try as best you can to have the mindset of helping them improve the quality of that paper, but also their future work, right? Because this is likely not going to be the only project they're engaged in. So it might not be fixable for this paper, but maybe you can help them understand this issue that helps them improve their future research. And so, I mean, ultimately, like, we can be teachers as reviewers, and I think that sort of mindset can be helpful, especially if you find yourself sort of in a sour mood, or if you're irritated by something that goes up in the paper. And I've also done, when I find myself feeling like that toward a paper, I will try to finish my review, but not turn it in and take a fresh look at it when I'm sort of maybe in a different with fresher eyes or what have you. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's so funny, because I was actually, the next question I was going to ask is the type of mindset that you take as you go to review a paper. So that was like a perfect next point. When I was reading online, some of the advice, the last thing that they said was to, after you finish, take a break and go back and look at it and kind of look at the language used and how harsh it is. And if you would ever read something as not, I guess, weighing, is this constructive versus criticizing, and just thinking about how others might interpret what you're saying.
I think that's good advice. I sometimes do that, as you heard, although I don't always do that. But I think that is generally good advice. I also think, though, I see that a lot, but I don't think we should be also afraid of being critical, right? Like, because we are sort of trying to safeguard the quality of knowledge and other things. So, but as you know, you can make a critique with varying sort of tones that come into the writing, and I can tell you, I've gotten plenty of emails from authors that were upset about how something was written by a reviewer, or offended by it, or something like that. And so and if you've turned in a paper and gotten that feedback, you can understand sort of how it can feel to get something that's overly critical. But so I don't think we need to like hold back critiques, but we can talk about maybe framing them in a way that's generous in teaching as opposed to scolding, perhaps.
Wow. I love all of those. I'm kind of hearing, like, if, the high level 3 tips: 1, take your time, really give it the time you need. 2, review with humility, be open about any weaknesses you might have, and use those confidential comments to the editor to your advantage there. And then 3, like, really having the right mindset, a teaching mindset in order to improve the work.
And as far as an overall focus, I think you want to focus on the science and the research with attention to internal validity of the study. And then making sure that they're not sort of, a common thing I see is like this marketing piece in papers. And that is something that definitely will sort of can get under my skin a little bit. And making sure that the conclusions don't extend beyond what the results can draw. And that is something I very commonly see in papers. And I think it's something you can help the authors to not get too many steps ahead of that particular project.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Is there any advice, I guess, on the other side, for maybe even a seasoned reviewer? Are there common pitfalls of reviewing that you see across the board?
For the reviewers themselves, or common things that I see come up in papers as a reviewer? I
was thinking like as a reviewer, but I think for like in the paper too would be interesting. So
okay, yeah,
maybe both.
I'll start on the reviewer side for sure.
Okay.
I think that the reviews that I get that are probably the least helpful are reviews that recommend a reject, and then they have a very brief, sort of pithy response, where I might have like 3 sentences. And so it's like, okay, you hate the paper, but I'm not sure that you're giving the authors a lot of opportunity to improve it here.
Right.
And then keep in mind that could be paired up with, multiple reviews that really love the paper. And so then it's like, okay, clearly you see some opportunities, it's things that need to be improved here, but I can't really communicate that to the author. I see a number that go beyond what you need to do as a reviewer. And that is, I see some that put in, and I early in my career did this quite a bit actually, of doing a lot of copy editing for the authors. And so you do not have to be afraid to do that. I mean, it's good. It helps the authors copy their paper, but that is sort of taking on more than a reviewer needs to. And it's, almost putting yourself in the role of a co-author without getting to be co-author. And I'll tell you that as both an editor and a reviewer, I've had situations where I felt like that I put so much into this paper that I was practically an author, which is not an ideal circumstance, obviously. But, if there are issues with the quality of writing, I think a single generic comment mentioning that some further copy editing for language usage, or if it's more extreme, that professional copy editing may need to be considered, but you don't have to be the one that's doing that copy editing. You can focus on the science and the research. And, if you want to, and you do, I don't think that's a bad thing. You're, if anything, just helping the authors write better. But do know that that's not a requirement, I think, for review.
Thank you. Those were all super helpful. And I think it sounds like kind of either extreme of the spectrum you see, and like those are, you want to kind of move back to like moderate.
A short review is fine if you don't think there's anything wrong. But I think
Sure.
Where the short review is a problem is if you say this paper's terrible, but you don't give any specific feedback about what needs to be improved or what's wrong with it, or and I've seen some where it's like this idea is horrible and this should be published, or this is not new, and it's sort of like, well, it's not new, but I thought that there was, as an editor, presumably I thought that there was enough here to contribute to the knowledge
right.
to send it out for review. And the reality is, right, that as the process of advancing knowledge, we have to replicate work, and there has to be more than one study on a particular topic. And so,
right.
This idea that someone else has written a paper on this, therefore this is disqualified, seems sort of absurd to me. Especially against the backdrop too of how many studies that have not been replicated or where that hasn't happened. I mean, it's an important part of the process for people to look at it in a different data set or in a different or more rigorous way or what have you. So,
yeah, that's a really interesting point that I think I haven't really heard before. But we do talk about the importance of being able to replicate experiments, and that's a really good point.
I think it's my bias as a clinical researcher, because ultimately, there's no single study that's going to change anyone's medical practice, or very seldom anyway, right? And so it's sort of a growing of a knowledge base in the literature that ultimately changes things. I know a number of editors that use the criteria: is it new and is it true? In my mind, it's more like, is it true and are we sure it's true? Like the true piece is much more important than the new piece, because we really do have to have a body of knowledge on a particular topic to really understand it, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious too. So we've talked about how important the review process is, and I'm sure as a reviewer, it can be challenging to take on reviews sometimes. I'm wondering, are there times that you think that you should reject reviewing a paper, and what are some of the reasons for that? I guess I'm curious, maybe with like qualifications, but in terms of like time, it seems like I'm sure there are also times where, you feel very overwhelmed, and is this like the right thing to do at this time?
Yeah.
And I'm curious your thoughts.
That's a terrific question, and really even a precocious question for someone, at this stage in your career who's not getting a ton of invitations. But you're absolutely right. There are situations where you should decline. Every year I continue to do a similar number of reviews, but I end up declining more because I get invited more and more as my sort of name gets more out there. I think we do have a responsibility to review as scientists. That doesn't mean you have to accept every invitation that you get, and doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that you have to do a set number. So things that I would consider in whether I'm accepting or rejecting one is, how many do I have currently in my queue that I'm waiting to do? And my queue is a little bit more nebulous because I have a bunch that I'm managing as an editor. But if for instance, right now, I do have one that I'm late on. And so this is not a good time for me to be taking on a lot extra unless the deadline is reasonable and going to work. And so that's one thing I consider. And the other thing I consider is how closely does this match my content or methods expertise? And so if I'm sort of hovering at about my capacity for the number of reviews in my queue, I will reject one that's not central to my expertise, but I might reach for one that's like just squarely in my expertise. It's also, and I've described that T-shaped expertise, right? So I might be rejecting some that are on that horizontal bar of the T, but taking those that are on the vertical bar at that point.
I see.
And then at some point, if my load is too high, I'll be rejecting, any invitations. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that it is so important to decline instead of reject is probably the more appropriate word, to decline invitations when you can't do them. You would be surprised at the volume of invitations I send out that just get ignored. And then what happens is it's just waiting in the system for someone to respond until it expires. And there's, I set those dates and I don't even remember what mine is. I feel like it's 10 days or 2 weeks or something like that. But that's, if you know you can't do it or don't want to do it or it's not appropriate, it's best to just decline right away, because then I can see that it's declined in my queue and I know I need to invite more reviewers. Otherwise, what's happened is there's about a 2-week delay that gets added for the authors and getting their feedback. And then ultimately this paper getting published or being able to be disseminated to the broader community. So I strongly encourage people to decline those invites if you can't do them.
Yeah.
Now that being said, sometimes I'm like on that fence, like I described, and I might sit on it a while before accepting it. But please do decline it. It really makes the editor's job easier.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Another piece of advice that you gave me was to keep a log of all of the reviews that you do. And I thought that was a great piece of advice that I hadn't seen anywhere else. And so I'm curious if you could touch on that and if there's any other advice like that that maybe we wouldn't think about when we start, as we are reviewing.
Yeah, I do keep a log. I started it a couple years in, and it's much easier if you start earlier. So for those junior investigators on this, I encourage you to keep track. I keep track in an Excel file. I have a column for year. I have a row for the journal name, and then I keep track of how many I do. And I'll tell you, this helps in a number of ways. One, it helps me communicate how engaged I am in this process. And I think it's a really important process and one that gets, I think, short shrift within the scientific community. The second is I feel that this is an important responsibility as a scientist. And so it allows me to keep track of like how many am I doing in a given year, and am I sort of maintaining what I think is sort of my share more than my share. I don't think we want to do way more than our share, and we don't want to do less than our share, but I try to be in that my share or more range. So that's helpful. It also gives me a sense of what journals are sort of reaching out to me and that I have sort of a connection or a relationship with, and so that can be helpful. There are online services for this as well. So I use Publons, which seems to be one of the more popular ones. It is run by a competitor of my journal, but I don't really care so much about that. And so what I do is when I get my thank you, I forward it to Publons, and then I update my Excel file. And so then I have sort of both records that I can keep track of. The other thing that has come up from this is I've had some journals that seem to utilize me very heavily, and like more heavily than I utilize my own editorial board for my journal. And so on, I think 2 occasions I've said, I'm happy to continue to review for you, but I just wanted to let you know that I've reviewed for you like 12 times this year and 8 times last year. And, please consider me for your editorial board or something like that. And so I've gotten sort of connected with journals that way. I don't think you want to be obnoxious about that, but if you really are like reviewing more papers than a typical editorial board member, it's sort of worth sort of letting them know that you're sort of, carrying more than your weight at that time. So, and then I can also see how I'm spreading it around and sort of what journals I'm managing. So it doesn't take me a lot of time. I just get in the habit of, as soon as I get that thank you email, forward it to Publons, update my Excel, and then I'm done. And then also on my CV, I communicate like how many reviews I average a year, and I put it within a date range. Like, so between 2008 and 2012, I averaged, this range per year, and in this range, this many. And so it's a nice way to communicate that you're sort of doing your part. And I think that also may encourage others to be like, oh, wow, I'm not doing as many reviews as I could be. Because we really do need more people doing peer review and more people putting a full effort into it. And that's, I think, such a critical piece, as critical of a piece as people doing the science. Yeah,
for sure. I kind of think of it as like science jury duty,
that's
do your part.
Oh, that is a great analogy. I hope you don't mind. I may borrow from that. I'll try to cite you if I remember the source. But yeah, that is such a great example, right? Because it really is a duty.
Yeah. And I love that you're keeping track of it and making it sort of public, putting it on your resume. I've never seen that on a resume. So I think, or CV rather, I think that's.
Yeah. So I list the journals and then I put the total number that I do per year on there. And I'm trying to communicate that I think this is important because it is.
Yeah.
And And I love the jury duty analogy. That's gonna stick with me for a long time.
Good. Hopefully that doesn't deter people from it.
Yeah, that's right. It's like trying to get out of jury duty.
Yeah. Oh, I know them. Well, I guess that if you do know them, it gets you out, right? So thank you so much for sharing all of this really helpful advice. A lot of our reviewers are younger, a lot of our audience and listeners are younger. So I think this will be really helpful in helping them set up their career. And,
great. Well, I hope it inspires your audience to sort of, take seriously this important piece of the scientific process for sure.
Yeah, I was kind of going with, we have a lot of younger listeners that I think will really benefit from all the advice you've given. And we heard that you also gave advice to some students to prioritize by passion.
Yes.
Sounds like you've got a lot of things to kind of prioritize in your life. So we'd like to just hear about what you meant by that and tell us a little bit more.
Oh, thanks for asking about that. That is something that seems sort of goofy to say, but that I really am passionate about, is this idea of how do we prioritize. I went to, when I was junior in my career, I went to a time management or some related sort of workshop for faculty, and they were talking about prioritizing by importance instead of prioritizing by deadlines. And I sort of walked away from that saying like, oh, that makes sense, but we still need to meet our deadlines, and it's not especially inspiring. And so this brings me back also to, I referenced changing majors several times in college. And one of the reasons I ended up changing majors is I was setting my schedule for classes, and I was at that time a biochemistry major, and I was dreading a number of the classes that I was setting up, and I was very excited about a number of my classes in philosophy and psychology. And so then I just sort of thought to myself, like, well, if I'm really excited about these classes and I'm dreading these, what am I doing? And so I changed majors to philosophy and then later to psychology. Still was pre-med throughout that. But I think that we're most productive when we're doing something that we're excited about. And that excitement is, I think, the measure of that passion. And so in my mind, I want to be as productive as I can and have as much impact as I can during my limited time here. And so if I'm doing things that I'm most excited, most passionate about, I'm most likely to be productive. And now, of course, that has to be tempered by some realism about what things are important. And I think you still have to be conscientious enough to meet your deadlines. But oftentimes I'm sitting down and there's multiple things I can start working on or put on my schedule at that time. And I try to think about, what do I have the most energy for right now? And throw it into that, with the idea that I'll catch up on the things that are important and the things that I have to do by a certain time, because I'm just that kind of person that I'm not going to drop the ball on stuff. But as much of my time as I can dedicate to things that I have excitement and energy for, the more productive I'm going to be. Yeah. And I try to have that conversation with people that I'm bringing on in my new role as a department head, is trying to get my new faculty to be thinking about what is it that they're most excited about, because that's where they're probably going to have the most meaningful, satisfying, and productive careers, is if they're able to find whatever that is.
Yeah, we completely agree with that, and we talk about gauging our energies all the time. Hannah and I do, and it's really nice to hear that you encourage that to faculty that are coming on, and how you did that in your life with your courses, and just kind of that initial recognition that, some things I'm excited for and some things I'm not, and how can I make more of the things that I am excited about and bring me energy.
Yeah, and you still have to do some of those other things, but if you're paying attention to what you have that excitement and energy for, I think you'll be happier, more satisfied, more productive.
Sure. Definitely. That energy can also carry over to some of the things you're less excited for, and
absolutely.
That's a little less painful.
No, I think that's true. That brings up another thing that I sometimes talk about, and that is the idea of jobs and various things as being a package. And so these things come together as a package, and some things in that package are fun and exciting, and other things are a real chore. And if you can mentally tie those things together, like, yes, I have to do this, deal with this sort of patient there's this very difficult situation with, in the US, I used to refer to the examples of having to call insurance companies for pre-authorizations, right? That's just part of having to, I love caring for patients and work for patients. I hate calling insurance companies for a pre-auth, that's part of the package. And you know what I mean? Like I mentally lump it together to realize that I need to do these things. My current job, the thing that I'm most passionate about is setting up positions that nurture people's career development and, having discussions like I talked about what people are most excited or energized by. And, the sort of human resources, sort of drama sort of situations that come up in any place, I think are a lot less fun, right? But it's part of that package, right? Like I can't just help people create their dream position and then not deal with these other difficult situations, right? These things come together, and in my mind, I try to mentally marry some of those things. So.
Yeah, that's a really great way to frame it, especially as a package, kind of like a present, a gift.
Yeah. You can't be a grad student without also having some of the exams, right? Like you can't and be able to work in this sort of cutting edge lab, but not also have some of the stresses of the demands that come with that lab, right?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. So one of the questions that we always like to ask, and we like to talk about failure a lot on the podcast. So is there a time in your career, or even, we talked a lot about switching majors and I guess building up to your career. Is there a time that you felt like you failed, and what did you learn from that experience?
Yeah, so two pieces I'll mention. One is, so I think that the entire process of science for anyone that's honest, right, is a series of regular failures and rejections, right? I mean, I've had many papers rejected from journals. I've had, many grants that didn't get funded. And that is, I think, a natural part of the process. And I think it's important for people in senior positions to be open about that. So that way, junior people coming in aren't completely demoralized or think that their career is going to fall apart because of this paper didn't get accepted somewhere. And frankly, the peer review process is super important, but it's not perfect. And, I've had some papers that ended up, in particular, negative studies that I've found get rejected from multiple journals that I knew were more rigorous than some other papers that I had published. And I think you just kind of have to persist and take the mindset that's part of the process. I had a talk with some junior people as far as, I think it was some sort of mentorship symposium in Europe. And I'd mentioned that I had many papers rejected, and I had a junior person tell me, you probably shouldn't tell people that as the editor. And in my mindset, it's no, I feel like I should, because I'm rejecting papers routinely, and I shouldn't be coming off as if I'm somehow holier than thou. And, and my work is better than everyone else's. My work gets rejected too. And not all of my papers are my best work. Some things I have a better opportunity or have a more exciting result, and that's just part of the process. So another piece is that I have struggled to focus, and I think that can be a drawback of the prioritization by passion. And, I described this sort of nice T-shaped thing, but there are things that I get excited about that could be a distraction from some of the things that maybe I should be focusing on more. And so that's a challenge that I've certainly struggled with throughout my career. And I think I will continue to struggle with, because it's just sort of my nature to get excited about things. And it's also my deliberate strategy to prioritize by passion. And so that's something that I need to be sort of careful about.
I can totally relate to that. I think that's one of the good things about having my advisor at this point is he is very good about catching me and pulling me back. And I'd be a little bit concerned when I, don't have somebody to do that anymore, because I get so excited. I'm easily excitable and kind of, veer off and want to pursue something new. So right now it's nice to have somebody to reel me in, but I'll have to try to figure out some strategies to be able to do that on my own in the future.
Yeah, I think it is great to have an advisor or mentor that helps with that. That is a consistent piece of mentorship and advising that I've received as a mentee and advisee. And then I'll tell you that I haven't always followed.
Well, Da Vinci had he was a huge procrastinator, had tons of unfinished products, and was an extreme perfectionist. So I feel like it's so funny to see how different people sort of deal with these things. And I think it's nice to encourage that excitement, like you're saying, and prioritize by passion. And then, also have people to support you and help you kind of keep you on track when you need it.
Yeah. And, while I generally think that, that as a strategy, I could have been more focused throughout my career, it's also very hard for me to identify a project where I'd say like, oh, I wish I wouldn't have done this or that, not that there aren't any, but oftentimes, I had fun.
Well, before we ask our last question, we've been really excited to talk to you. We're really excited for others to get to connect with you. We're wondering, how can people learn more about you and your work? Like, do you have a Twitter, Instagram, where can people follow you?
I don't. I don't have any sort of social media presence in my professional life at this point. If people are interested in my work, I encourage them to check it out and read it. People are welcome to email me if they want to talk about it. That does bring a piece of advice, though, that I also have for people, is that I encourage you guys did your homework before meeting me. You read some interviews of me. You're familiarized yourself with my work. And I think that's a good approach in general for networking. So whether it's you're meeting someone at a conference, take a few minutes to look over and see what they're doing. You'll remember it better because you have a person that you're connecting it to, or when you're doing job interviews, to, take the extra time in preparation of looking over the work of the person that's interviewing you, picking a couple of pieces that are of most interest to you and reading those. And they don't necessarily have to be their pieces that were their most cited or their biggest piece, but the pieces that maybe are most appealing to you. Or you're meeting with someone even at your own institution for lunch or coffee to talk about something, try to take a little time to get a sense of what they're doing. You might be surprised at stuff that they were doing that you had no idea or weren't aware of either. So that's, I think, something that can be valuable. But perhaps I need to step up my social media presence. But, I think right now I don't have the bandwidth or the passion for it.
Well, thank you again for really everything that you've shared. We have one final question, which we love to ask, and we're really excited to hear your answer, is what are you most excited about for the future of medicine?
That's a great question. And I don't have a super clear answer for that. And within my field, I'm hoping to circle back to what we talked about earlier, that we're able to better parse out sort of more physiologically homogeneous groupings. But the other piece, I think that the piece that I think makes me most excited about any research is something that's actually going to improve people's lives. And in the case of medical research, is going to change practice. And there really isn't a lot of practice changing research that goes on. And so I think it's really important for us to sort of keep our eye on the ball. And I'm not saying that work in sort of the basic science that doesn't have direct clinical applications isn't valuable or other things. But what gets me most excited about is something that I may be able to offer to a patient and their family 5 or 10 years from now. And I don't know what that is. Perhaps you guys will bring some of that about.
Yeah.
We hope so.
Thank you. That is exciting and something to think about. And I think, sometimes it is that we don't have something so clear as to what it looks like that we're excited about. But I think just having that driving motivation for the work that we're doing is really great. So thank you for sharing that, and for sharing your advice about peer review, for sharing some of your research, which I thought was super interesting. It was really nice to finally meet, beyond email and get to know you and your work better. So we really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks for the invitation, the opportunity. It was great meeting you guys. I enjoyed this.
So thank you again to Jess for that awesome interview. We covered not just the peer review process, but so many other topics that were really exciting that we weren't expecting, but we're happy to hear about. And now we will talk about some of our research fails.
Woo!
Research fails. Yes, it does.
Melissa and I have really fun phone calls sometimes, and I feel like she had a fun one where we figured out a research fail that she had to say. We did sort of this exchange. Like, Melissa has to share this one if I share this one. And both of the things are escaping me now. So maybe that's a fail in itself.
I remember yours. Yours is that you needed to do work in the bathroom because I forget why. It's warmer, or
it's warm. Yes.
It's warmer in your bathroom. So you post up to do your work in the bathroom.
It's true. My bathroom is so nice and warm in the morning, and my bedroom is freezing, which makes me really not want to get out of bed. But yeah, if I can go to the nice warm bathroom, there's some motivation there.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I remember mine. We were in lab meeting, like just the very start of lab meeting, and I spilled an entire water bottle full all over myself. Like, I don't, you know, when you see something happening in slow motion and you just like, you're just watching it and it's like not stopping. Like, I just watched like 30 ounces of water just spill all over me. And it like, I was standing outside for lab meeting and it got all over my clothes, but also then like into my shoes. And we were all like presenting at lab meeting. There's never a good time to leave. So I just like stood there in squishy shoes and just like totally soaked for 2 hours, which wasn't super fun.
And I have one other research fail that happened with, you know, when you're just so deep in, you know, some data or writing that you just don't really see some of the obvious things. Because you're just like, if you just walked up to it and looked at it, you'd be like, oh my gosh, this is staring you straight in the face. But sometimes when you're just like deep in it. So this happened to us. And we were trying to say that these two data sets were similar. And we had these two plots to say, look at both of them. And since the two plots look similar, we were like, oh, a similar trend is happening in both of these data sets. But it turns out that we just were mistakenly plotting the same data twice. And it was like slightly different because of the way the plot was rendered, that the plots like that we didn't notice it right away, but we eventually noticed it. Then we're like, well, how did we not see this? That was fun.
Yeah, that's right. Just being like, oh, wow, these like are really exhibiting the same pattern.
Exactly. Like, wow, we've really found something.
We really found something here. And then you're like, wow, we really found a mistake here.
Yeah. This is why peer review is important. Everything we just talked about. It's good to have lots of eyes.
Yes, exactly. Well, good catch. And thank you for listening to this episode of Biomechanics on Our Minds.
And thank you to the International Society of Biomechanics for all of their wonderful support.
Thank you to Peter Washington for the awesome music.
And if you'd like to submit a research fail, someone to interview, or just get involved in Boom, please email us at biomechanicsonOurMinds@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter at biomechanicsOOM.
Or follow us on Instagram now at Biomechanics on Our Minds. We're going to be posting exclusive content on Instagram. So you're not going to want to miss it.
That was the best ad I've ever heard.
Yeah. Follow at Biomechanics on Our Minds for all of the best content, all the best update, the best
You've
way
just
to
convinced me to follow.
They convince you to unfollow and then refollow it.
1,000 times so you get 1,000 notifications.
I'm Melissa.
And I'm Hannah.
Biomechanics
off our minds. Hey, I think that was a good one.